Chapter 5. Who Are You? It took Harley only a flying moment to realise that her initial presumption of telekinesis was far from the mark. When you've witnessed such a power firsthand, it stands to every conceivable reason that you would assume the same under such similar circumstances. Being a hunter requires keen attention to details, however, unless you're content on being consumed in a very literal sense by the shortest career of your life. Between the huntress and her husband, they had seen, studied, heard and battled most everything known to man, or so Harley thought, at least, and yet this was new. Unquestionably new. There had been a priest once, Father Javier, possessed by a ruthless demonic entity he himself had sought to exorcise from a youth who, for the sake of sanity, Harley had purged almost entirely from her mind, though the sight of the boy's mutilated remains still haunted her dreams. The demon, while in possession of Javier in particular, had displayed the ability to influence nightmares. He had declared his powers rooted in darkness itself, and boasted that they suffered but a taste of his true power. Noticing the swirling, semi-formed, almost cloud of smoky darkness taking shape, returning to itself after the act of casting Cecily aside, Harley's heart plummeted as those ugly memories of one of the worst hunts in 15 years rose to the surface. As the cloud's density solidified, and Harley, eyes only leaving the site when necessary, rummaged through her pouch for the emergency cure-all which would restore enough strength to at least allow her escape, the unexpected happened again. The cloud twitched, studying the huntress as it swayed, animated with life. Harley tensed, halting her search. She flexed her fingers at the hilt and lowered into a readied stance, skirting the pain screaming from her limbs as she had done so many occasions before. A sentient cloud serpent, the gathered darkness darted off, worming its path around pillars, furniture and provisions, navigating the battleground in the greatest hurry, while simultaneously, it seemed, eager to explore. The lightest scrape of footsteps to the left. Harley pivoted, Cecily closing fast, sword drawn and features contorted into an elated frenzy, inflamed by the thrall of battle rage. The Valkyrie vampire vanished. Shit! Harley cursed, stumbling as she sought her position. Robert's roar filled the air, stripping the huntress of her focus at the most pivotal of times, a lapse she knew should have doomed her to the grave. Cecily was not an adversary one could oppose with divided attention. However, Robert's cry was alleviated as swift as it came, supplanted by Miles's which, in its shock and hostility, halted Cecily's advance dead. Cecily recovered from the stunning force of her attunement with Miles with the swiftness afforded by a millennium of skill. The prey was wounded, weakened, and slower than drugged-up sloth in comparison. Whoever had struck her was nowhere in sight, operating from distant shadows, she presumed. Fangs bared, blade primed, Cecily bore down on Harley, surrendering to the blood rush and ready to end this all with one final blow. To hell with learning the secret if her inamorato was in jeopardy. And perhaps the hunter yet lived enough to scavenge his memories in the blood sight as they drained him. If fortune was kind, there was a chance the mysteries of Prometheus remained open to them. Truthfully, however, Cecily gave no true care to the power. Prometheus's flame, the unstoppable fire, was Lucia's desire. The self-appointed queen didn't scare Cecily, despite her claims of being one of few vampires not to begin life as a human, or her purported 5,000 years on the planet, or her closeness to Lord Andar. Though the nightmarish lord, now he evoked a healthy terror in all his subjects, the queen included, though she would never show it. Andar prized the flame far less than his so-called daughter, and his word was the true law. He would understand. He was no stranger to the tides of war. Her blade angled for the kill, carving the air with searing speed, the clang of an intercept, reverberations flooding Cecily's arm. Impossible! Her eyes flared, running the length of the curious weapon which had interrupted her, a double-ended combat scythe in the shape of an S, then diving into the wielding figure emerging from wisps of smoky darkness. What are you? The figure threw off her dark cowl with a paradoxical grace, given that her hands were otherwise occupied and unable to the task. Conjured from nothingness without a shred of effort, it seemed invisible digits had aided the act, hands of earthbound spectres revealing vividly violet tresses in a tempest of curls, underscored by darkness, punctuated with sharp eyes of purest emerald. The interloper's black-tinted lips curled into a cocky smirk. With one fluid motion, she shoved Cecily's attack back, creating space as she divided the scythe in two with the slightest of effort, as though the weapon itself wanted the transformation and bowed eagerly to her will. Dual rushing whirlwinds scythed deadly circles around the violet-haired interloper's hands, then came to an abrupt stop as the peculiar opponent lowered into a readied stance. Cecily's eyes narrowed, lips pursed. There was not much she had not experienced in this life, and while the discoveries of anomalies evoked profound fascination in her, this was not the time. With a growl, she pressed her assault, masterfully seeking an opening in the violet one's defences, and, to her astonishment, finding none, receiving minor nicks in return. "You have to know you can't win this," the interloper smirked as they disengaged. "Out of my way!" Cecily cried. She charged again, swung, and almost lost her balance as she barreled right through the suddenly incorporeal pest, whose eyes, Cecily was certain she was not mistaken, morphed into the iciest arctic blue in the instant of ghosting. The interloper turned, grin widening as she twirled her separated hand sides in each hand, then reconnected them without the ends ever meeting. Cecily knew what she'd seen. Perhaps when she had been a mortal, or even in her early centuries as a blood drinker, the bizarre sight of shadowy tendrils forming between the handles of the separate weapons, uniting them, would have commanded more awe. It wasn't that her curiosity wasn't piqued. In all honesty, she could not recall a time when it had been more so, but the gravity of the few actions the interloper displayed, coupled with the urgency to reach Miles, was one she felt keenly. Cecily wasted no time. She did not fight for pride, not any longer, not since the Allfather had set her on the path of night, the path to her paramour. Summoning all her considerable strength, the Valkyrie vampire vanished from mortal eyes, and the timely interloper watched with astute focus, tracing the bloodsucker's every step carrying her to her beloved's aid. Time and again, Miles's vicious nails raked in substantial darkness. Time and again, the unfazed shadow struck back, shackling his wrists, hurling him aside with arms perfectly at ease switching between physical and wraith-like. A significant gash to the left shoulder ruined his long coat, though did little to thwart his efforts. Despite his preoccupation with the vexing, toying darkness, the unbleedable foe, that his own wound would not stop weeping evoked Miles's strongest concern. He had fed well, and did not lack the power of millennia-refined blood, notwithstanding the meagre centuries under his belt. Cecily, and, more recently, the Queen herself, had made certain of that. The cut had struck out of nowhere only seconds after he buried his fangs into the hunter. The offender gave no indication of presence, a feat most unsettling to the diminutive vampire. A searing sting no more than a pest in the beginning, evolving now into genuine worry and ire. Growling, Miles launched another fruitless attempt to injure Shadows, only to be captured by the swirling chaos and deposited face first with unforgiving force. Cecily appeared by his side, her firm arm grasping for his. "Did she hurt you, my love?" Miles withdrew his hand from her as he rose to his full height, brandishing now the gnarled dagger which had hung dormant at his hip while battling the hunter. "She?" he asked, scanning for his vanished attacker. Miles followed Cecily's fierce stare. Her mind freely presented him with images of the violet-haired woman and her impossible scythe, as clear as though a recording, a skill along with the others of the mind, which Miles valued among the finest any vampire could seek to perfect, for it offered him now his first glimpse of the true threat to their duty, the wielder of the darkness and her abilities, without the need for genuine first-hand experience. "Fascinating," he breathed a note of respect as the interloper rounded the toppled wreckage of units, eyes fixed on the vampires. Excuse me. Robert clutched his palm to the puncture wounds on his neck, stemming the flow of blood, while he hunted for the preloaded syringe which would seal his wound and boost recovery. The bite hadn't been long or drastically deep, but the sight before him made Robert question for a moment if he was far more broken than he'd allowed himself to believe. No, that wasn't it. The tiny one, Miles, flitted in erratic gusts as a maniac on hot coals, harassed by a sentient gathering of darkness. Shadows fed by every light-starved crevice of the department store, unending fuel which dissipated with each advantage the vampire sought, offering no quarter as it countered and flung the tiny bloodsucker around like a hellhound with a chew toy. Robert stifled a chuckle as Miles bit the ground, hard, then caught his breath, part induced by the pain of battle, and part the abrupt, unusual sight of his apparent rescuer, though it wasn't her intriguing weapon or the manner of the shadows which enveloped her, awaiting command. No. As she approached the reunited vampires, it was the eyes which struck Robert. Not so much at first, but the instant Miles and Cecily launched their combined offensive, and those emeralds froze to the iciest blues. The violet-haired one herself dissipated, body losing substance in the physical realm, slipping into the ethereal, untouchable and incapable of interacting. Except, not unable exactly. Far from it, in fact. Their saviour displayed exemplary timing and skill, phasing through most every attack the united might of the vampires could muster, and returning to the material plane to strike with her vengeance. Her actions struck chords within Robert of wraiths he had encountered over the years, but no earthbound spirit he had ever known or heard of possessed the talent to manifest in such an extraordinary way. Not even the most malevolent poltergeists with aid from the living could achieve such feats. Harley dropped beside Robert, catching the hunter unawares. "Jesus, Robbie, you let that stunted shit take a bite?" Robert allowed her concerned hands to take over, eyes fastened to the display, brows pinched in studious fascination. "Tell me you kept your wits about you, babe." "Hey!" Harley snapped her fingers mere inches from her husband's face. Robert shook his head, then winced. He got nothing more than old memories of Mom's apple pies. He cringed again as the needle slid into his neck, flooding his system with the serene, warming concoctions of magic and science. "That was too close," Harley muttered, nibbling her lip. "Who is that?" Robert's gaze remained rooted to the vampires, struggling, despite their coordination and strength, to lay any damage or cause any real threat to their mysterious saviour. "Beats the shit out of me." Harley spared the spectacle a glance, though the battered sight of her husband drew her focus back before she could blink. "But thank God she's on our side." Robert shuffled into position, seeking to rise with Harley's aid. Breathing reigning under control, he met his wife's gaze. "We don't know that." Harley's jaw clenched, eyes sharpening as she returned a firm nod. "Any sight of the kid?" Robert's question drove the mournful attention of his wife to the bodies of Scott and Gary. "Nah," Robert clarified, inspecting his neck wound with a cautious digit. "The other one. The girl." There is not much an immortal has to fear, but immortal is not eternal. Such arrogance costs lives, thieving centuries, even millennia, from those who would otherwise stand stronger than Atlas, indifferent to the winds of time. Miles was neither fool nor arrogant. The interloper phased from the corporeal as his dagger knifed in. Miles pounced, leading with his nails as she reformed, and again met with disappointment as the problematic pest withdrew from the domain of the manifested. Grunting as he landed, Miles pivoted the instant Cecily's swift accompaniment to his attacks earned only more failure. Blocks from the mysterious scythe combined with flawless disembodiment timing and counterstrikes to draw blood from his beloved. This was a challenge unlike any other. Miles had recognised that before ever catching sight of the intriguing interloper, whose scent was strikingly absent. In over 2 centuries, he had never encountered a creature of this earth not crawling with their own distinct odour. True, some vampires who develop powers of the mind neglect the versatility of the senses shared by common mortals. Miles was not one of those fools. Perhaps it was because reliance on his sharpness of intellect was all he had known since his youth. Maybe it owed more to the unshakable mental fortitude he'd developed since his dark rebirth, or the generations by Cecily's side. Likely a combination had acted in the guidance of his belief that in training all of his enhanced senses. After all, it seemed only wise to whet the edge of each of his gifts, especially given his aptitude in cloaking and fending off psychic intrusions. Miles recognised the impenetrable citadel of his mind and sought to enforce it with every means at his disposal, and now his efforts proved their worth. To come up against a foe so unreadable, so undetectable, was everything he had concerned himself over in the isolated corners of the darkest nights. Unlike the arrogant, he acknowledged the subtleties of power as well as the manifest before his eyes. With due discretion, Miles extended his thoughts in silence to Cecily's mind. "My love, Portugal, 1872. Cecily gave a surreptitious nod. The interloper, her back to Miles, spared him an over-the-shoulder glance and dared a smirk as the vampiric duo launched their pincer. For a moment, the tide changed, reversing and forcing the violet-haired pest on the back heel in the wake of an intricately deceptive attacks, sweeping and crossing her guard, catching her close-fitting battle garb and drawing the minutest lines of blood. Understandably, no scent in the world strikes a vampire's senses more profoundly than blood. The second her blood's aroma hit Miles' ultra-sensitive nostrils was the instant he recognised their error. Though the pragmatic fortress of his ever-questioning mind had been nagging him ever since the apparent success of their latest tactic. Surely the interloper could phase her way into a more favourable position. Could a simple play in homage to their details in the 19th to their ordeals in the 19th century truly hold the key to victory, or was this all by design? That blood, though. Human blood carries the sweetest aroma of intoxication, the kind of irresistible lure which fuels desire and floods life throughout the spirit, charging, empowering anticipation. Animal blood is far less potent and aphrodisiac, but still boasts appeal. The scent of her blood, however, was Pandora's box unleashed, bearing only promises undesired, assurances of one fate above all others. Death, Miles whispered, dark peridot eyes widening. The moment was blinding and nimble. A sneer on those black-tinted lips, each of their strikes intercepted, clashing against the remarkable steel of the renewed handsides. Darkness swirling as the shadowy bitch again abandoned the corporeal realm. Cast on its head, the room span violently. Darkness exerted insurmountable pressure on Miles, clamping, crushing his skull before depositing him as detritus at the far end of the cavernous chamber of survival and former commerce. Portugal? The interloper turned, playing out long, confident strides as she stalked the pair. Blood filled Miles' mouth, and not the kind he was hoping for. His fists thundered into the concrete, punching a crater in the floor as he rose to his weakening legs and tempered his fire. Cecily made it to her feet first. Miles recognised her desires and shared sentiments. "Well now," he chuckled, sweeping grime from his long coat and embracing all he knew best. "You are a fascinating one." "She smells of death," Cecily added, eyes narrowing, stance lowering, sword swaying adroitly. The interloper returned a laugh so natural it held no hidden motives or intent. With a casual upward flick of her wrists, the scythes dissipated into nothingness, though Miles suspected he saw something slip under the cover of her cuffs. With a confident smile playing at the edge of her lips, the interloper drew the curls of her loose hair into an obedient ponytail, though with no material to hold it in place. Of this, Miles was certain. "Interesting observation," she said, advancing another step. "What are you?" Miles demanded, edging back. The interloper's grin became a dagger, vicious and purposeful. "Your worst fucking nightmare." Cecily braced, scanning the obvious threat, the approaching battered hunters, and registering the energized gallop of the remaining child's terrified heartbeat. "There is no prize in this battle," she said, glancing to Miles, then back to the warrior of darkness. "Only a glorious death in the waiting halls of Valhalla." The interloper's brow raised as she rested one hand on her hip and cocked her head to the side, a remarkable model of elegance and destruction. "And what would you know of death? Creatures like you have no real concept, though you boast to be masters of it. You understand nothing of the truth. And what truth is that? Death comes for even the mightiest." Miles huffed in amusement. "Dear child, how you flatter and disparage in one fell swoop is a marvel almost as intriguing as yourself. However," the interloper's laugh cut through his words, "silly little blood drinker, you don't recognise the game you're playing, the rules or contestants. I almost pity you." "Miles," Cecily's cadence carried her evident urgency. "Yes, my love," he replied, stare boring into the unnaturally gleaming eyes of the wielder of darkness, desperate to figure her out despite the bizarre and unexpected futility of his efforts. "I believe you're right. Our Lord will assuredly desire word of this girl." His gaze darted to the wounded hunters seeking to lend their aid. "Mustn't delay." Cecily's grin widened, still fueled with confident malice. "Until next time," she cooed, offering a childlike finger wave.